We are being joined by Rich Outson, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Jamestown Foundation from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us on WION, Rich, and good to see you. So there is this funding bill issue that the House is facing right now. It's unclear whether it would even pass the Senate if, the House decides to take money away from the IRS and just solely provide aid to Israel and forget about Ukraine border security and whatnot. Can Washington still function to provide military aid to allies fighting for their survival at this point?
Susan, it's good to be with you. I will not try to describe in detail or with any sympathy the way that such decisions are made in Washington. There's a lot of gamesmanship, though, and I think even as we find that in conflict situations overseas, that even while people are fighting one another, that there's still back channel contacts. For instance, the Russians and Ukrainians at some level still talk about prisoner exchanges and things like that. I think the same thing happens between the Republicans and the Democrats, frankly, where there's a lot of positioning, a lot of posturing, and a real struggle over resource priorities. But in the end, there's certain things that they know have to go on. So every time we come up against a spending limit or the sort of the budget cycles disjunctions in the U.S., what we do find is that things get passed within a short period of time if it means that national defense and other critical priorities that are really still bipartisan and consensus positions are endangered. I think Israel aid is one of those. Ukraine aid's a little different because on the Republican side, there is a significant wing that's more skeptical about tying those two together. But my read on the Republican congressional group at this point, both Senate and House, is that while there is a lot of criticism of what they consider a blank check to Ukraine, there's still a consensus for some aid. So I think even with sort of the chaos we've seen around the election of a new speaker and the failure to get timely appropriations and authorizations passed, we'll see some sort of an omnibus or a conglomerate spending bill that gets those two funded. I think the war funding for Israel and Ukraine will pass.
Yeah, and I think the president and the Democrats put that border security spending in that bill as well, hoping that the Republicans would come around. U.S. President Joe Biden has recently warmed up to an idea of a humanitarian pause in the Israel-Hamas conflict. How do you see that, this idea of a quote-unquote humanitarian pause, and how is Israel likely to respond to a suggestion like this, considering the fact that we know Secretary of State Antony Blinken is due in Israel on Friday?
Yeah, well, so this is actually pretty typical for Israel's wars over the many decades of its existence, where the United States provides practical aid for Israeli military operations, intelligence, logistics, rhetorical support, while also pressing for a quick conclusion so as to prevent human suffering and spreading the conflict to other countries in the region. That's, I think, the same dynamic that's playing out here. Look, I respect what the Biden administration is doing on this, pressing for humanitarian access, for instance, so that water and food, especially to the less heavily combated southern part of Gaza, can get through. It's the right position for the United States to take. But there's a difference between humanitarian access and a humanitarian pause. If by pause they mean to stop the operations in the northern part of Gaza, I think that's the wrong position. I'll tell you why. Even in 2014, when Israel had the last big round of fighting in Gaza, they said, we're going after the tunnels. And the tunnels, which go hundreds of meters below the surface of Gaza and all throughout the northern part through Gaza City and its various extensions, is really the center of gravity for Hamas fighters that allows them to threaten Israel. In 2014, Israel did a very limited ground campaign that stopped after about 2.5 weeks, and they never really got to that tunnel network. So I think the U.S. has to chew gum and walk at the same time here. It has to press for humanitarian access and approve funding and plan for what comes next to help the Palestinian people. But I don't think we want to stop Israel before it gets to the Gaza City tunnel network, because that just would guarantee another round of fighting like this in a couple of years.
Yeah, and we heard time and again from Hamas officials that they don't plan to stop attacking Israel. There was a video interview just yesterday that's been going around. I'm sure you saw that as well. Rich, great to talk to you. Please come back, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Thank you, Susan.